they got to put it in the comb, and they got to get rid of excess moisture. If they are forced to eat a thin diet, and nothing but a thin diet, they can't handle it. They'll blow up, you know, they'll get edema, because they don't have kidneys like we do. They can excrete some moisture, but they're not designed to eat a high moisture diet. They're designed to eat honey and a little bit of nectar. Mostly the nurse bees take the nectar and mix their hypopharyngeal gland mixture with it and feed it to the larvae. So early spring check in February is going to let you know if they're light. You avoid colonies. Most colonies in North Carolina starve in very late February or early March. And the ones that starve first are usually the big, strong colonies. The ones that when the first dandelion and the henbit and red-dead nettle started blooming, man, they went to town. They came out of the winter strong, and then the queen takes off, and you got brood everywhere. And then you have a rainy spell of 3 or 4 days, and they got to feed all that brood, and there's nothing coming in. And so they lose weight. Like if they were on a scale, electronic scale, you could watch the scale just going down, 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 because they got a lot of brood. If they didn't have a lot of brood, the scale would be going down very slow. But with all this brood, it's going, and then they starve, because bees starve when they run out of energy. Like, give them maybe 6 hours and they're dead. You know, they don't have any storage. I mean, like me, I got enough fat, I could probably walk the Appalachian Trail without eating anything. But honeybees aren't made like we are. They don't store a lot of fat, and they need glucose. But we already covered that. We need winter bees that live a long time, and viruses get in the way of it. They got fat bodies. They got a higher vitellogenin. That's just a growth hormone and a protein, and they got more of it. And so part of the reason they live longer is because they're not foraging, because foraging is pretty stressful. And the rest of it is the way they were raised. They were raised with a high protein diet. Takes a lot of pollen to get winter bees. There's controversy whether if you have a moderate climate like ours, they even make winter bees or not. Doesn't matter. They need a high protein diet, and you need bees that can live till February at least. And if we lived in upstate New York, they need to live till May. So longevity is called for. And then we talked about this, the correlation between varroa levels and the virus levels. High varroa levels equal high virus levels. You lower the varroa levels, and then there's a lag, and then the viruses come in. And of course, it interferes with winter bees. The foreign wing virus is the most severe form, and that's the only one that you can see, really. These other viruses, well, except for paralysis viruses, which pops up occasionally, but it's not often. We see it a couple times a year. And then they'll be shivering and trembling and look like they've been poisoned with pesticides or something. And it's a viral infection. But most of these viruses don't have any outside symptoms. I guess what I'm getting at, even the foreign wing virus type 2 doesn't have the foreign wing. But the foreign wing virus type A and B or 1 and 2 is a systemic virus that affects their brain, their neurological system, their gut. It just goes all throughout the body. So it severely shortens their lifespan and interferes with the nurse bee's ability to feed the larvae, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that most of these other viruses shorten their lifespan. And here's just a quote in a study that basically points out that a lower viral level equal higher survivability, which really makes sense. I'll let you read that. I'm not going to read it to you. I know y'all can read it. So what's the major causes of winter mortality in eastern North Carolina? I say it's dwindling. How do I define dwindling? The cluster enters the winter at a reasonable size. In other words, you think you got a reasonable cluster. And then you watch the cluster as the winter progresses. Let's say you start watching in October. In November, it gets smaller. In December, it gets a lot smaller. In early January, it's like a softball. What is going on? They're supposed to live months, and now they've shrunk down to a softball. Well, their cluster size is very important because the smaller they get, the less capable they are of regulating their temperature. And when they get this small, they can't regulate the temperature. That means they can't rear brood. And that means it's probably going to damage the queen. If they survive, she's going to be damaged because she can't tolerate, anything. It's a time temperature equation, but once she gets in the mid-40s, she's going to be damaged if she stays there for a couple of days in the mid-40s. She's going to be messed up. She'll be alive, but she ain't going to be working right. Cluster gets smaller and smaller, and it declines, and it's very small. They lose the ability to regulate. They usually, what I see, they usually got plenty of food, okay? But they still shrink. It's got nothing to do with food. You look at the bottom board and there's a few dead bees on the bottom. Well, what happened to all these bees that when they were out here and they shrank to here? They didn't fall on the bottom board. Well, where do sick bees go when they die? I mean, naturally. What's their natural instinct? Get out of the hive, that's right. And so these bees, either they feel bad and they crawl out of the hive to die, and they're in the grass if you could find them. And another interesting thing about virus levels, higher viral levels in a foraging bee causes the foraging bee to lose its ability to regulate its temperature, which is not as important in the summertime, but in the fall and winter. We have warm days all throughout the winter, and they can forage anytime. Most bees forage in the high 40s. And, but the problem is, if you got a sick bee, she loses her ability to regulate her temperature. She goes out on a foraging trip, and she doesn't realize she's getting cold, and it's time to go home. And so she chills and dies out there in the woods. And so you don't ever see it. And that's why it's important to have healthy bees, because they can get back home before they die, and you don't have this dwindling problem. They can fly, sometimes they crawl outside, and that's their natural instinct to help control disease. Some beekeepers call it collapse, colony collapse disorder. Well, I could do a whole thing about colony collapse. Colony collapse is an unfortunate name because it describes a syndrome, and it took a long time to unravel it. But basically, it mostly affected beekeepers who pollinated almonds in 2016 and 2017, and it caused devastating losses, mysterious losses. Bees have disappeared from the colony and left the queen and a few workers, plenty of honey and lots of brood in the almond orchard. Very mysterious. Anyway, like I say, I don't want to give a whole talk on that, but they figured out what it was. It had something to do with a fungicide they thought was safe for honeybees, which they sprayed when the stuff was blooming, the almonds were blooming. Found out after research that fungicide compromised the immune system. So you got a whole bunch of bees with a compromised immune system. Then they had something called Nosema disease, but we always assumed that Nosema was caused by Apis mellifera, Nosema apis, I'm sorry. And come to find out when they started doing their little DNA testing, that they had Apis cerana, which is native to the Indian honeybee, where the broiler came from. And nobody realized that. Well, the two Nosemas are different pathogens, or different symptoms. And Nosema cerana affects the entire, not just the gut, but the entire body. And it's more devastating, and it also is not just a wintertime disease, it's all year round disease. So these things combined together is basically what's blamed for colony collapse. I've not seen a classic colony collapse symptom in North Carolina, period. Now, I've seen a lot of colonies who population collapsed to nothing slowly, especially in the wintertime. I call it dwindling. And the literature is replete with mysterious bee die-offs in the wintertime going all the way back to the late 1800s. Every 4 or 5 years, something mysterious happens and there's a heavy die-off. And then they recover and they go 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 years, and then there's another mysterious die-off. And we probably just had one last winter, which I'm sure you've heard about in the media. And we may never know what happened, but it didn't affect all beekeepers. Some beekeepers came out about normal, and some lost 80, 90% of the colony. Okay, this kind of dwindling, there you go, they got down to almost nothing. There's honey right over there. These bees, I think these are dead. Yeah, they're dead. They're the last rice. That's what, well, obviously I put an extreme case in there to make the point, but they get it where they can't regulate the temperature. And if they got any brood at all, I don't care if it's 3 cells of brood, they'll sit there on those 3 cells of brood to try to keep it warm. And you have food 6 inches away, and they'll starve to death because they can't reach the food and keep the bees warm and the brood warm at the same time. That's just the way they are. So I see that over and over again. You get a little patch of brood, you get a little tiny cluster, and it turns cold one night, and they sit right on that brood, and they starve. And they got honey right over there. But see, if there were a normal cluster, they'd be able to either break cluster, get a little food, and come back, or the cluster would be big enough to span the honey and the brood at the same time. Another advantage of having a decent sized cluster. How to prevent it? Well, you control broil early, so you get more long-lived bees. Don't forget that lag time. You gotta have healthy bees. Another aspect of disease control is looking for brood disease, like American foul brood. And fall is a great time to look for it because usually, if you discover it in the fall, the colony is still alive. It hasn't been robbed out. And so if you catch it early enough, you can limit the damage to that one colony. But if you let it go and you try to nurse them through the winter, and they come out weak, and AFB is continuing to reduce their numbers, then they're going to get robbed. And when they get robbed, they're going to spread those spores throughout the entire apiary, and then that's going to cause everybody to get sick. And I've seen it. I've seen 100 colonies in one location, 100 nukes, I should say. Every one of them had American foul brood. And it's because the beekeeper split a bunch of colonies that weren't all sick, but some of them were, and he had AFB cells scattered throughout the whole outfit, 100 offspring nukes. And if he'd have caught it before he started splitting, it would have limited the damage. We used to be able to kill the bees and fumigate the equipment, and they took our permit to fumigate away, and so now we don't have a fumigation option. So if you get American foul brood, I'm going to have to help you burn it. And so that's the only option we got right now. I suppose we could let you ship it to Florida where they have a radiation, but the time you shipped it there, paid them for the radiation, and got it back, you could buy a brand new super cheap. Radiation is expensive. So just real quick, just points. If you see coffee-colored brood, call one of me if you're in my territory or another apiary inspector and identify it. Not all brown brood is American foul brood, but the ropey, thick kind is, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So if you see brown brood, coffee-colored brood, anything like that, just get it identified. It could be European foul brood, a lot less serious. It's not a spore former. It's not as contagious. But still, you don't want to be making splits with European foul brood and stuff like that. And if it's a bad case, you don't want to try to get them through the winter because they're not going to make it. So you need to know that. If it's a light case, you might can get your friendly veterinarian to write your script and get you some EFB treatment, which usually one cycle of 3 weeks will take care of it, unless it's a terrible case. And then it's probably futile. Either way, it doesn't matter what disease you got, if you catch it early, it's always better. Just like if you're, anyway, don't get me off track. You know, a large animal gets called out to the farmer's house to look at his sick cow when the cow has been down for 3 days and can't get up. That's a little late to get your money's worth out of the vet. You need to call when she first gets sick. Have you got enough honey to last till spring? Now, these are all approximates, because it depends on how big the colony is and how soon they brood up in the spring, because the faster they brood up, the more honey they're gonna eat. But generally speaking, I'd like to go into the winter with when I say a full-size colony, I'm talking about a deep and a 6 5/8 super, not a double deep necessarily. And they need about 60 pounds of honey in that thing. That would be the shallow super, pretty much full, and the deep having honey on both sides of the cluster. Something like that, roughly. And then you can add that weight of the wood or whatever. And once you get used to it, like in the middle of the winter, if you're wondering how your bees are doing, you can just reach over there and tip the hive up, and you'll get a feel for is it got a lot of weight there, or is it just feels like empty boxes? And if it feels really light, then you bust them open and see how bad it is, and then feed them. And if you have to feed in the winter, give them thick syrup, or you can put a candy on them, or you can put a patty on them, and you can salvage those colonies. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. The yellow representing honey, and the center being the cluster, and maybe a little bit of brood and pollen or whatever they're doing down there at that time of year. So what to feed if they need something to get them through the winter? I mean, the price of honey, I mean, if you really want to push the limits, you can take your honey off and feed them back sugar, but it's not as cheap as it used to be. Sugar is kind of pricey if you've had to buy any this year. And it's a pain to feed bees. I don't like feeding. It's a real pain. Honey is ideal. I don't mean feeding honey. I mean honey in the combs. You know, honey that the bees put up. Just let them eat it. That's probably the best winter feed. Sugar syrup is the next best. Why sugar syrup? Well, sugar syrup is, when I say make sugar syrup, most of us here have to make it. You don't buy a tanker load already made up. And it's white granulated sugar, which is nothing but crystallized sucrose, okay? And that's what nectar is. Nectar is sucrose, sugar-wise. Now, I know it's got all that good stuff in there, polyphenols and plant rosins and extracts and good stuff that gives flavor in, but the bees don't have to have that, but they do have to have the sugar. Don't feed brown sugar, don't feed molasses, don't feed damaged sugar, don't feed burnt sugar, just pure, grocery store sugar. If you're willing to put it in your coffee, and the bees can eat it. Fructose is probably second best. Beekeepers used to get access, the pickle plant used to let beekeepers have high fructose corn syrup. And that has some advantages. One of them, you don't have to mix it, but, and it'll definitely get your colonies through the winter. I mean, commercial beekeepers still use a lot of it because they get a tank load of it. It's already mixed up, they pump it out, and it gets them through the winter. What is the sugar molecules in fructose? Well, it's fructose and a little bit of, well, mostly fructose. But what is the major sugar in honey? It's fructose, okay? So really, what high fructose corn syrup is an analog or imitation honey. And sugar, mixed up with sugar syrup, is an analog for nectar. So in the spring, if you want to build your bees up fast, feed them sugar syrup, thin, which mimics nectar. They get all excited and the queen starts laying. But wait till spring to be doing that. Don't do it in the wintertime. Certainly don't feed them thin syrup in the wintertime. That's very stressful. And you can feed candy, you can feed fondant. 2-to-1 sugar to water ratio. It doesn't matter about the weight. Fortunately for us, the weight of a volume of water and the weight of a volume of crystallized sugar is about the same. So you can use ratio, weight, either way, it doesn't matter. And I just don't use any special deals. Coke syrup, I've seen beekeepers feed Coke syrup, reject Coke syrup. Matter of fact, I saw one place where they put the leftover Mountain Dew, Pepsi, Fanta, all in a barrel, together, and the bees will take it down, but it ain't good for them. They don't do well. It gives them indigestion. Crystallized honey is not great for winter feed, but only if you got a whole super of it. You know, if you got a few frames with a little crystallized honey in there, that don't matter. They can work it up on a warm day by gathering water and turning the crystals into syrup. But if you got a whole super, like, I put Astra up there because it's probably the worst offender. Late in the year, if you're where there's a ton of it, you can get frame after frame of Astra honey, and it crystallizes as soon as they put it in the frame. Cotton crystallizes fast, but it's early in the season, it's warm weather, and most of the time you got time to take that off, extract it, sell it for a good price. But Astra comes in late in the, you can't extract Astra. How to feed bees? Well, there's about 100 ways to feed bees. I put this up here because it shows how rudimentary you can be in feed bees. This is just pickle jars with holes punched in the lid, turned over a standard intercover, and that'll work. It'll work great, actually. Now, except for the labor to have to put the syrup in there and put it on. It would work even better if you put an empty beak on top of that, and then put the telescoping lid on there, and then you wouldn't see it, the thing, and a strong wind wouldn't blow it over. But it gets the job done. But you can use top feeders, you can use division board feeders. The front feeders don't work so well in cold weather, but you know, if the weather's mild, they'll work, you know, a front feeder, a board feeder. You know, when it's 40 degrees, they'll run down there and get a little syrup and take it back up. You can do that. Let me go back to, I was talking about, hang on a second. I want to talk about the candy. You can make candy, bees work it. It's kind of like an insurance policy. You know, if you're going to take your vacation to the Bahamas and you're worried about your bees while you're gone for a month, you can put a candy board on them, even though they got some honey, just in case. And so if you get delayed coming back, you know, everything's fine. If you don't want to mix up candy, just take a board or an intercover like this. This intercover here, a standard intercover like this will hold 5-pound bag of sugar poured around its circle in the middle. And so that's 5 pounds of just, that's the equivalent to 10 pounds of 50-50 syrup. And just let them come up there and get it when they want it. If they don't need it, they won't get a lot of it. If they get a little bit short, they'll eat it faster. I knew a pretty big beekeeper, for most of us, he had 700 colonies. He put sugar on every one of them. Just poured it around the intercover. And then he had insurance. He didn't have to worry about them. Most of them would be fine because he left honey on them and then gave that for an insurance policy. And then he could go take his vacation in the wintertime and not worry. What did he do in the spring for those colonies? He didn't eat it. He just went around and took the thing and bounced it into an empty barrel and saved it for next year. Dried sugar. It doesn't spoil. You know, if it had been liquid sugar, it would have been moldy in no time. Anyway, just pointed that out to you. Pollen, you know, that's everything that sugar and nectar is not. Pollen is protein, fat, vitamins, antioxidants, and minerals. So honey's the carbohydrates and the energy in it. Honey's got a little bit of suspended pollen and some plant phenols, makes it good and tasty. You gotta have good pollen for healthy bees and broodbeer. And you gotta have good pollen in the fall to make those winter bees. And we're very blessed here in North Carolina, I think, for most of us. We get a lot of pollen all year round. Starting in January, it's dandelions blooming and henbit, red-head nettle. That's great. And many places don't have that. And we have fall pollen. Now, some years are worse than others. This year, I don't know. In my region, it's a little bit iffy. Not much goldenrod. Goldenrod doesn't make much honey, but it does make pollen halfway decent. Stored pollen that they made early in the season will do. You know, fresh pollen is better, but stored pollen, at least made this year, will do just fine. You know, that's a great alternative. And a lot of my colonies have got almost too much pollen from earlier in the year, so they'll be fine. But I'm just saying that in your location, if you don't have pollen in the colony, and there's none coming in the fall, you might have to resort to a pollen pad. But almost no one in eastern North Carolina has to use a pollen pad. Almost no one. And pollen patties are great for feeding small hobbies. you can really make them happy with a pollen bag. If you have to use it, use a small bag and replace it often, and then you can have a chance to kill those beetles that reproduce in that short period of time. One way you can tell if your colony has plenty of high quality pollen is look at the young larvae. If they look like that, they've got plenty of pollen. But when the colony gets stressed and gets short of pollen, or stressed by any other reason, but it's usually pollen, it could be nectar as well, they're not fed as well. They'll be sitting in there almost dry with just the tiniest minimum amount of larval food to keep them going. But when there's plenty of nutrients and plenty of healthy nurse bees, they're going to look like that. And you don't have a pollen problem when you look like that. And if you have to do a pollen supplement, feed a quality one, and most people just need to buy it. Don't try to mix your own, because most of the recipes for mixing your own are not nearly as good as commercial. A lot of them use brewer's yeast and soy flour. Use the wrong soy flour, it's actually toxic. You gotta have an expelled processed soy flour, not the regular kind. Not the kind you buy in grocery stores. Stuff like that. And you can feed dry pollen. If you know that you're short of pollen in the fall, you can put dry pollen out there, and if they need it, they'll work it. They'll collect it and bring it back to the colony. You don't have to worry about beetles that way. And also in the spring, I've seen some people do it to try to stimulate them in the spring. This is what I call a nice cluster. That's what I'd like to see in my bees going into winter. That's the top of the bee. And what is that? That's like a little bit bigger than a basketball, maybe. On a chilly day, you know, when they are actually clustered. If it was a warm day, they'd be wall-to-wall bees. Cluster produces heat, it regulates temperature, and if it covers 6 to 8 frames, that would be ideal in my opinion going into winter. Now, of course, you can winter. I got beekeepers that winter 5-frame nucs by paying careful attention to them. You can do it, but I don't recommend it unless you're an experienced beekeeper and you're just having fun. You know, you can do it. I mean, and this ain't a nuc rearing class. But I mean, some beekeepers stack 5-frame boxes on top of one another like 3 high and winter them that way, and then when spring comes, then they bust them down and give them a sale. That's the safest way to do it. But some make them up in the fall and try to get the singles through the winter. That's dangerous. I don't recommend it, but it can be done sometimes. So how do they make honey? I mean, how do they make food? How do they make heat with food from honey? I don't recommend getting old. But the alternative sucks.
Right.
Yeah.
They contract their wing muscles and they produce heat. So you might have looked at a cluster in cold weather and you look like it, well, that's just making heat. So it looks like shivering, but to us, shivering is a negative. I'm about to get in trouble. For them, that's normal. I mean, that's just ordinary cold weather behavior. They're making heat. 92 Fahrenheit if there's brood present, minimum. Cluster does not try to heat the inside of the colony. Then there's going to be some heat escape from the cluster, which is going to warm up the colony. But the beehive is basically shelter from wet and wind. In other words, it's a windbreak and a reprieve from moisture. And cluster attempts to heat the cluster. And the outside bees are the insulation. And when they get chilly, they move to the inside. And warmer bees move to the outside and then just keep rotating like that. That's how they do it. Years ago, I talked to a beekeeper who kept bees in Alaska outdoors. He wintered them outdoors. He wasn't in North Alaska, he was in Haines, Alaska. But he said it took about 80 pounds of honey to get through the winter, 80 or 90. And you might ask, well, why in the world? Because their spring doesn't start until late May, and their winter starts like late July, you know, it's not much time. But they have like fireweed and a bunch of other plants that bloom when the spring comes. And a strong colony can make 300 pounds of honey with no problem. So, ironically, with the shortest season imaginable, they make huge crops of honey. and they have to leave 80 or 90 pounds on to get through the winter, but that's still a 200-pound surplus. And basically his recipe was a large cluster, plenty of non-crystallized honey, and he did some light packing, nothing major, and wintering them outdoors in Alaska. That's an infrared image of a cluster. It's probably got a little brood in the center at 92 Fahrenheit. And as you can see, it gets cooler as you get closer to the outside. And the outside is going to be in the 50s somewhere. And that's taking infrared from outside the colony. And that you can estimate that this is later in the winter. They moved up from the bottom to the top super, and they're a little bit off center over there. You know, if a beekeeper was just going through the bee yard, I might go check on them and then move them back in the center and put the honey on both sides. But it might be fine, especially if spring is right around the corner. Size is important because a large cluster can move easily to reach food and consume it, and then consume it in cold weather. No matter how cold it gets, they can reach their honey. In other words, they're not going to be bound up because it turned cold. Large clusters can span supers. In other words, small clusters sometimes get caught by the gap between supers, and so they run out of honey in the bottom super, and they, in a bad cold spell, they won't go across that gap to get honey in the super above, and they'll stop. Large clusters are not going to have that problem. They're going to just bump across that little gap and start eating the honey, no problem. Small clusters can starve with plenty of stores on them, no question about that. The gap between the supers, we just talked about that. Heat retention and control is easier. The surface of the cluster is where it loses heat, and the smaller the cluster gets, the less heat producing, which is in the middle, and the greater the heat loss, which is on the outside. For example, you know, the center is where the heat's made, and it dissipates from the outside, obviously. We already talked about that. The colder it gets, the denser the cluster gets. So they get tight, you know, if it's 0, they get really tight. It warms up, they get loose, and on about 48 or 9, they start breaking cluster flying. 45. They're dark bees, they'll be flying at 40.
Let me ask you a question before I lose it out on that.
Yes, sir.
If you got a length, you got a long length of hive, okay, and they're putting the honey on the left side, and you don't have none on the right, do you think you need to move some on the right side?
Well, I am not a long lane expert, but I would like to have honey on both sides of the cluster.
I'm just trying to, this is my first time trying this, so I was listening to what you said.
Yeah, most wild bee colonies expand upward, and so I get confused when they have to go this way or they have to go that way because I'm a simple guy. But I would put it on both sides. Some math. Now, if you got mathematicians or teachers in the audience, you can correct my formula. But I think this formula for computing the surface of a sphere is 4 times pi times the radius squared, and the volume is computed by 4/3 pi times the radius cubed, okay? I think that's right. Now this part might be wrong, but this example, a 6-inch cluster has that much volume, and a surface area of that much volume, which leaves it a 2-to-1 ratio from volume to surface, or vice versa. And a double the size gives you a 4-to-1 ratio, which is an advantage. And that advantage continues until you get to diminishing returns. So the larger the cluster, the advantage is rapid, is what I'm getting at. Double the cluster, 4 times the advantage, okay? So that basketball cluster, if it was to lose 1/3 of its size, it would still be of a size cluster that can manage cold snaps and movements and whatever. But if you start out with something tiny and it shrinks to half tiny, then they're limited in what they can do. They're a real disadvantage. That's the point. And I guess I always instinctively knew that, but when you do the math, it's surprising in how damaging it is to them when they shrink by half. It's just devastating in their temperature control. And of course, when bees eat honey and they turn it into heat, just like us, if we breathe on a mirror, it gets fogged up from moisture and CO2. Well, bees exhale moisture and CO2. And that moisture in cold weather is going to rise from the cluster. And if you have a cold surface, it can condense and then drip back down on you. And that's why some recommend top ventilation or a quilt board or something. And I find in Eastern North Carolina, a lot of ventilation is not necessary unless you got an unusual surface. If you got like metal that's exposed to the top of the cluster, and metal is quickly going to condense and drip. But if it's a wood or something that doesn't transmit heat fast, then chances are it's not going to drip. But if you see mold started on the top of your frames, you got a moisture problem. You need to do something about it. Give them some moisture. Some ventilation and reduce the moisture. Like a toothpick works for most colonies in North Carolina, but your mileage may vary because you're in a different spot, and you might be in the edge of a swamp or on the top of a hill. Some empty comb in the middle is good. What happens if you overfeed your bee? Well, I'm nervous, I'm anxious, I don't want my bees to starve, but I'm going to cram that feed in there. Well, if you cram it in there, they'll take it, and they'll cover all the combs, they'll fill them up with syrup. Well, then in the winter, they got nowhere to have that little tiny bit of brood that they want, or at least they got to make room for it. And then if it's a big cluster, they're sitting on all this cold syrup. Honey and syrup are cold compared to the comb that's pollen or brood, because wax doesn't transmit heat very fast. It's a good insulator, and pollen doesn't either, and neither does brood. But syrup is a pretty good, transmitter of heat. Just like if you go outside in cold weather and you put your hand on a wooden table, it feels cold, but it's not shockingly cold. But you put your hands on a metal table at the same temperature, and it's really cold, and if you have moisture on your hands, it might stick to it, like lick the flagpole down. Well, they're the same temperature. What's the difference? The rapidity which is transferred from your hand to the object. Same thing here. We're talking about how fast heat transfers in the cluster to what they're sitting on. Most people don't have this trouble, but usually when you overfeed your bees, you either have this trouble or then later on you have swarming because they're overstimulated in the spring and they start swarming in January, and that doesn't work. Don't do that. So think of the honeybees like pets. You don't want to overfeed your cat or your dog, and then you take them to the vet, and the vet gets, you got to fight him on a diet, or you're going to kill him early. So don't overfeed your bees. But they won't get fat, but it will mess up their colony a lot. Interest reducers is a good idea. It keeps, you got a standard bottom board, it helps keep mice out. And bees get robby in the fall, and it helps them protect their colony from neighborhood bees who won't steal their honey. Oyster hives, in February or January or whenever you need to make sure they're not white. And even in weather like that, you can still hoist the hives and see how healthy they are. But most bees starve in early March in North Carolina, in my part of North Carolina. And warm winters are terrible for winter. Warm winters cause bees to eat lots of honey, lots of starvation danger. It's just the best winters that I can remember were winters that were cold consistently pretty much until it wasn't. And then it warmed up and stayed warm. But we don't get a whole lot of it. The bees do really well when that happens. Do you recognize what's wrong in that picture?
Starved.
They're all dead. They look pretty good, but they're dead. Recently dead. And look at these, I don't know where it is. I know where this one is. You see these cells? They got bees with their heads in the cell and their tails stuck out. That's classic when you see that. The last little bit, they're in there scraping the bottom of the jar out, and they just run out of energy and die with their head in the cell. And these guys didn't even get a cell to die in. They just died on the outside of the colony. And, I've seen colonies that were like in between, they're in the middle of starving, so you had some dead in there, and the ones on the outside were still, sort of alive. You can sprinkle sugar syrup on them and bring some of them back to life, but it's a hopeless cause. If you bring some of them back to life, you might can add them after they come back to life to another colony. That beekeeper could have probably gotten there the day before and saved that whole colony. It's probably less than 24 hours old. Yep, empty dead cells, running out of food, and they can also starve with getting food out of reach. In other words, it'll be warm and everything's lovely, and then we'll have a cold snap for 1 or 2 days, and then sit there, and that small cluster starves with food right over here. Something like that. They're over there on a little tiny bit of brood, and their honey's over here, and they're dead. Food's out of reach. How can you prevent it? Well, if you got a small cluster and you're trying to nurse them till spring, just make sure they got honey in the immediate vicinity of the cluster. And if they're really small, make you some candy, like queen cage type candy, powdered sugar and syrup into a dough, and put it right over their little heads wherever they're at. So they got no excuse for starving. And you might can nurse them till warm weather. And here's a beekeeper. I took this picture. He was wintering a 5-frame loop like I was telling you not to do. But he just put granulated sugar on a newspaper, okay? So they could come up around the edges and eat it, and then as they continue to eat it, they chew the newspaper away and get access to more of it. And so it started out, well, exactly right here. You probably had sugar overall, and they've eaten about half of it. And they were otherwise healthy and decently strong. That was taken on a cold day, decent. I mean, not boiling over, but decently strong. I'm pretty sure that they made it through the winter. You see, he just put an empty 5-frame box on top of it and put a lid over there to make room for it. You could have put a rim. If you had rims, you could put a rim on there.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be better, say he had to boil some honey, just get him a jar, chop and pour honey on there would be better than that sugar?
It would not. These have a hard time handling cold honey that's not diluted, especially in cold weather. So feeding straight honey liquid is not a good idea for multiple reasons. They have a hard time taking it and processing it, and if you don't know where the honey came from, you run the risk of introducing foul brood spores, because honey has foul brood spores in it. If it came from an apiary, it had foul brood. Now, fortunately, the incidence of foul brood in North Carolina has fallen from what it has been in years past. Like we had a year recently where we didn't have any in the whole state. But I already told you about the one beekeeper that had 100. I saw a beekeeper within the last 5 years that had 60. So can't relax. But the good news is either you guys are getting better at identifying it, or we're killing so many bees that it doesn't have time to get foothold. I don't know what you do.
Take bees.
So if you lose a hive in winter and you're trying to figure out what happened to it, try not to disturb it. It's already dead. Just leave it in place. Don't clean it up and put it in a barn and then ask the inspector, what happened? Leave it in place, call the inspector, and when he comes out, or she, the clues are there. And an experienced person can read the clues and give you, might not can tell you exactly what happened, but give you a clue. No, you can tell whether they starved to death or not. You can tell whether they got robbed out or not. Got weak and those bees come and took their lunch away, and stuff like that. And to die of disease or whatever. So just leave it intact. And then you can examine it for clues and then tear it apart. Some people in Eastern North Carolina pack their bees, but I don't recommend it. Why? Right there, humidity and temperature. If you're keeping bees in upstate New York and you have precipitation in the wintertime, what's it going with? Much snow or ice? How much freezing rain, just regular rain, are they going to have? Not much in upstate New York. All right. In Eastern North Carolina, what's the usual winter precipitation look like? Rain, just flat, cold rain. And occasionally we have freezing rain and whatnot. So that's a huge difference right there. You pack your bees, and we have a high moisture environment anyway. The average moisture content here in the wintertime is usually above 50% all winter. And upstate New York is probably always below 50%, probably closer to 20%. Huge difference. So when you pack your bees, you can collect the moisture that comes in the form of rain, and then it can't dry out fast because it's trapped by the packing material. And it can really cause a detriment to the colony. In other words, it's not neutral, and it can actually cause problems. Some of the western beekeepers, in the mountains where it gets windy and a little bit colder, they like to look for a windbreak. They look for a natural windbreak of a hill or trees, or maybe if it's a small beekeeper, they get them on the right side of a barn, the south side of a barn, keep the north wind off of them. And that's all that's necessary. I mean, there's thousands of colonies wintered in eastern North Carolina and western North Carolina, in the mountains, in a deep and a shallow super, outdoors with no packing, where the wind can blow and it can get zero, and they do just fine if you keep plenty of honey on them and you go in with a healthy cluster. What I just said. Don't pack them unless you got a good reason, and I can't think of a good reason right now. You might come up with one. Temps are nowhere near the northern states, and we just don't need packing. And the sunshine on the packing later in the winter, or even on a warm day, can actually push the bees out sooner than they need to be out, because they don't realize how cold it is. That's kind of a northern version of packing. We don't have that. Now, this is the Eastern North Carolina pack job for a nuke. That's a 5-ring nuke. And not only am I not going to tell you who it was, but I right now I can't remember the name, but it was in one of my 26 counties, all right? And they were concerned about the nuke, okay?
That was all they had left.
They asked for an inspection, and it took me longer to unwrap the thing than it did to inspect the hive. But, I mean, they were ready for everything. Rain, no problem. We got a roof with a drip line that's not gonna get them wet. If there's a hurricane comes, we got enough bricks to keep the top from blowing off.
That's right.
And don't forget the tie down.
Now, would you at least put a bottom board in for the winter? I mean, like I have all screen bottoms on mine.
It looks like we got a
Yeah.
solid.
At least a bottom.
Yeah, he had a solid bottom. But, yeah. By the way, he got that weak nuke through the winter. But now see, look what he did, either intentionally or by accident. He solved most of those problems I was talking about. He got the rain away from the insulation. And this, I don't know if you can tell, this is foam insulation on the outside. It's not asphalt, it's not roofing paper. And so that's not likely to get a whole lot of moisture behind it, especially with that big roof.
He was probably right proud of that for you.
I didn't take that I'm in admiration more than anything. In quilt boards, some people use them, some people don't. I mean, I would say that it's not necessary, but they do work. How's that? Quilt boards are not a new thing. I see advertisements for buying them or something, and it makes it sound like, hey man, you need to get this latest, hottest thing. Quilt boards come back from northern Europe 100 years ago, where they literally put quilts, like you wrap up in on top of the beehive to help keep them warm. And they're in an area like upstate New York where it gets really cold. And then, somebody in Europe or America figured out, well, you can put shavings, wood shavings in there and do the same thing. And so it absorbs moisture, makes a great place for a mouse to live if you can get in there. But, it's really not necessary, but if you want to use one, it works.
What about newspaper in the top,
Uh,
above the inner cover?
I'm not aware that there's any downside to it, and I don't know anything about its efficacy, but if it absorbs moisture and it works, then use it. Beekeepers are very, inventive, and, I see things every month that, I've never seen before, and I've been doing this for 32 years. This is just an overview. Keep your clusters strong and healthy as you can, control disease before winter gets there. Evaluate your colony weight early and periodically. Feed early if necessary, but don't feed all winter unless it's necessary. Keep food enriching the cluster, especially if it's a small one. And don't forget to give some kind of interest reduction and a little bit of top ventilation, and that will solve most of your problems. And if you have moisture problems, then give them more ventilation or put a quilt board on. And that looks good to me. I wish all of my colonies looked like that in the fall. Recipe for success. And that doesn't happen very often, but I can remember twice in my business career where it happened just that bad twice in North Carolina, both times in March. One March 2nd, 1980, and the other was in pretty late March, like the 20th or something. It does happen, but we don't have to worry about that. It's usually snow and freezing rain, and as I repeat again, warm winters are our enemy. It messes everything up. They eat too much, they brood up too fast, and then they starve or they swarm early. It's not good. But ironically, if you get that cold winter I was talking about, that ideal cold winter, and then it warms up, your swarming season is condensed and it's later, like it's supposed to be. And it gives you time to prevent swarming. You can make splits or whatever you're gonna do. So there you go. You can contact me at that email address.
Got rid of that real quick.
You didn't get that? Never mind. I'm gonna be busy with the fair for the next, I don't know how long.
Does anybody have any questions?
Overwintering, one box or two boxes?
Is it
Single
hot bodies or shallows?
A deep, can you overwinter with just one deep, or do you need to add an extra box on the top, be it a deep or a medium?
Wintering in a single deep is a thing, but for most beekeepers, I don't recommend it because it requires more attention than two supers. But it can be done if there's a reason to do it.
But we don't need to force our hives into smaller boxes to get through winter, right?
No. I mean, a decent winter-sized cluster will fit in a deep and a shallow, or too deep, but most winter bees are not gonna fill up too deep. Yeah, so from a space point of view, two deeps are not necessary, but from a manipulation point of view, it makes it convenient if you want to split them in the spring, you got the same size frame. Now, I've worked with several commercial beekeepers in my relatively long career and ran all the same size, 6 and 5/8. And 2 for the brood nest, 1 for a food chamber. So basically 3, and that 3, 6 and 5/8 are roughly equivalent to a deep and a shallow. And that works really well once you get used to it. Now, some people are not used to it, but I see people who have bad backs. All 6 and 5/8 would work great for them. And, he had 6,000 colonies with 6 5/8 in all of them, and so he seemed to think it worked just fine. When they start making splits, you just split the 6 5/8 instead of deep. And, it can work, but not many people do it. But just keep in the back of your mind. And double deeps work, it's fine, and it makes it easy to make splits. But, and single high bodies will work, but don't, like Kirby said, don't cram them into it to make it work. Now, I would just, one cautionary tale, don't stack a lot of extra equipment on top of your wintering bees, because it gives a place for hive beetles to hang out and reproduce. As a general rule, weaker colonies, especially in warm weather, it's more important between now and frost, because hive beetles are aggressive and they'll take over a weak colony. And how to prevent them from taking over a weak colony is to, when you go into your hive, see how well the frames are covered, wax frames. And if they're not covered well at all, take them out and maybe put a division board feeder in there and just jam up what you got left as a divider, like a divider board. And don't let them have any more comb than they can cover. And that'll help keep the beetles under control. But once those beetles have free reign of a couple of frames, then they can just take over. And it only takes like a week to go from having adult beetles to being slimed to death. Any questions for me? I know I'm talking too long, but, and some of you probably seen this before, but it's the only thing I got on wintering. I figured it would be better to be topical. It helps to review, even if you already know it. Controlling the roll. What most of you use to control the roll? Auxiliary?
Everything.
Foreman Pro. What time do you use it, in early spring or late fall?
I just moved here, I came from Nebraska, so I used it early spring and late fall.
Well, you can do that in North Carolina, but warm weather comes earlier, so you have to use it earlier. Yeah, it works great in cooler weather, and it's awful in hot weather. Well, good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.